Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Hamid Bendas, and I am co-chair of the Student Civic Engagement Committee for the Institute of Politics Student Advisory Council. My role consists mostly of creating and coordinating exciting civic engagement opportunities for our students to participate in. For example, right now I'm managing about a dozen students to go into Chicago public schools and teach middle school students how to run for office, which is very exciting. Academically, I am a political science and statistics, or I'm seeking a political science major and statistics minor. And as fate would have it, my statistics midterm is actually just in a couple hours. So if you could, during the question and answer session, keep people like myself in mind, because I'm sure our panelists have a lot of interesting things to say about public opinion tracking in the 2012 race, but this might be my best chance to get a really great answer to questions like, how do I know what my margin of error is? And what do all these buttons do? With that, and to give answers to those questions and more, I would like to introduce today's panelists. Mark Blumenthal is the senior polling editor at the Huffington Post, and where he manages HuffPost Polling, which publishes and aggregates public opinion data into interactive charts and provides commentary and analysis. Before joining the Huffington Post, he was the polling analyst for the National Journal. Anna Greenberg is senior vice president of Greenberg Quinlan Rosner, a leading survey research methodology and strategic consulting firm. Anna has advised such elected officials as Mayor Rahm Emanuel, as well as organizations such as SEIU and the AFL-CIO. She received her PhD from the University of Chicago. Mark Mellman is president of and CEO of the Mellman Group, a leading public opinion research and communication strategy firm. He twice was named Pollster of the Year by the American Association of Political Consultants. Bill McInturff is a partner and co-founder of Public Opinion Strategies, which the New York Times has called the leading Republican polling company. Along with Peter Hart, McInturff conducts the NBC News Wall Street Journal poll and also conducts polling on economic trends for CNBC. Our moderator this afternoon is Joel Benenson. Benenson is a visiting fellow at the Institute of Politics and served as President Obama's chief pollster during the 2008 and 2012 campaigns. Prior to that, he worked on President Clinton's 1996 re-election campaign and has also advised such organizations as the NFL, AARP, and SEIU. He's the president and CEO of Benenson Strategy Group. So with that, we'd like to thank our panel for giving the Institute the privilege of hosting them, and it's certainly been an honor to introduce them here. And with that, please join me in introducing this afternoon's panel.
Thank you, everybody, for being here. Enjoy your lunch. I come from New York, where eating and talking went on all the time at home. It was the same thing. We thought the verb came from the same root. I want to thank our hosts here at the Institute, and I especially want to thank my colleagues in this profession who are seated to my left: Mark Blumenthal, Anna Greenberg, Bill McInturff, and Mark Mellman. My name's Joel Benenson. I'll moderate this panel today, and we're going to focus on public polling, and I want to get to that subject very quickly. All of these folks are also people, some do release public polls and work for candidates and campaigns. Mark is now, as they mentioned, a leading aggregator, and we'll talk about that, and does a lot of forecasting and modeling on his site, which was very innovative when he founded it and still is. But before we do that, I thought I've gotten a lot of questions here this week from folks at the university. I took a very nonlinear path to end up as a pollster, which was really a second or even third career for me. And I thought I would just, maybe if we just go from starting at the far end with Mark Mellman, if maybe each of you could just share with folks in the room here kind of how you became a pollster and what that path was and got you to being among the most renowned pollsters in America.
Well, thanks, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. It was sort of a serendipitous path, to be sure. I was a graduate student with Mark Hansen at at Yale, and someone called me up and said, I'm an unknown legal aid lawyer. I want to run for Congress against an incumbent. I have no chance. Will you help me? And I said, well, I will, but I heard about a guy named Stan Greenberg who was doing the same thing and is actually charging people for that. So I said, well, you know what? I'm going to charge you $2,000. He said, well, let me call you back about that, because I'm not sure that's going to work. But eventually we worked it out. We won a big upset, and a few years later, I moved to Washington.
I spent about 8 or 9 years of my career running campaigns and working for the national party committees. And then my first boss, who later turned my first boss in polling, was Richard Worthland. And at the time, he had $1 million a year contract with the Republican National Committee to do polling, essentially for the president, and no one ever saw the data. And in the second term, there was a lot of uproar about that. And so part of my job at the RNC was to be the person who would take that data and then translate it to the national parties, state parties around the country, and use all that data. The person I worked with was Neil Newhouse, who then recruited me to the Worthland Group. Then we set up our own business. But the real reason I became a pollster was my wife announced we were starting our family and having children. And she said, hey, I'm on this short list. I like you. And you have to be home to raise these children with me. And you can no longer do special elections and do these campaigns. So you have to pick a job where you live in Washington. She said, why don't you become chief of staff to a House member, or do, so you can do something in politics. So I interviewed for those jobs, and I realized the only thing that made me excited was talking to them about the re-election campaign, and that I had zero interest in serving as a chief of staff on the Hill. And I said to her, hey, look, I want to stay where I do campaigns for a living, and so I'll be a pollster. And I travel a lot, but I never traveled the way you travel, where you go move somewhere for 3 months to do an election. And so that was a big drive for how I picked being a pollster in terms of what I could do in politics, so I could be home more.
Well, so my first job was, as I was explaining to folks on this panel just now, was photocopying questionnaires in my basement for Stan Greenberg. So there's a lot of DNA here all mixed up together, who was my father. And so that was sort of my summer job and my college job, working in the firm, doing sort of everything. But my intention was to be an academic, and I attended the University of Chicago, as you probably know from my bio. And what I would say about Chicago was it taught me how to think, and also Mark Hansen, a big part of teaching me how to think about research questions, how to think about bias. And I was always completely taken by politics and always felt drawn to politics, but also loved sort of having a theoretical sort of overlay over it to sort of think about it more broadly. And I ended up teaching at the Kennedy School for 4 years. And while I was there, I taught survey research methodology and public opinion, but I really didn't like being an academic. And so I had a little bit of an opportunity to do some consulting for a company that was called Intersurvey, which was the precursor to a company called Knowledge Network, started in part by Norman Nye, who was here in the political science department. It was really one of the two first really rigorous efforts to try to figure out how to do online polling. And I loved it, and it turned out I was really good at marketing. And so I said, I need to be doing this. And so I sort of on a whim, just left and went to work for my father's company again. And that's what I've been doing ever since for the last 12 years.
Great.
I'm not sure there's a linear path to being a polling aggregator. And to be honest, I mean, I guess how I got here was sort of nonlinear in that I was a political junkie when I was one of those kids in the 70s. There weren't many of us running home from sports camp so I could watch the Watergate hearing. By the time I was in high school and college, I was working on campaigns, even getting paid occasionally, and I knew that I wanted to be involved in politics, and I knew that strategy and sort of being behind the scenes was something that I would kill to be able to do for a living. But I didn't realize that I could be a pollster until I dropped out of law school in Washington, D.C., and got a job at a polling firm right about the time when spreadsheets were starting to proliferate, which took the arithmetic right out of math. Just awesome. And now I didn't have to do long division in my head, and I thought I can really do this. And I did that. I did what everyone else on this panel did for a living for a long time, and then was sort of a combination of being short on clients and bored, and decided to start blogging about what I did, not knowing, just thinking this was going to be a way to kill a month or two on the way to restarting my client list in 2005, and it took off. I blogged about the 2004 election as a mystery pollster, and built this audience and had so much fun doing it that I then embarked on a path to try to figure out how to make it my day job. It ended up at Pollster.com and HuffPost Pollster. And I will say one other thing. I did not learn about politics at the University of Chicago. However, I have a Chicago connection that I'm proud of, which is that in my first job when I was 24, one of the first clients I got to work for was running all the tabs for the re-election of Mayor Harold Washington, because I worked for a consultant who was the pollster, along with David Axelrod. And because of that race, and because we worked on the short-lived Paul Simon race after that, I got to know the gentleman that you all now know so well, which taught me a lot about politics, how to be a consultant, and one of those things you look back on and tell your kids when he's on TV, I know that guy, and proud of it.
Great. Thanks, everybody. I want to hear from everybody as much as you want on each question, and then we'll get to questions from all of you. If you can, and Mark, I want to start with you, because you probably more than any of the others of us, you've been on both the side as a pollster for a campaign and working an awful lot with the public polls as an aggregator and with your site. If you had to boil down the difference between what campaign pollsters do and what pollsters who are releasing their data for public consumption do, to the essential differences, what would those essential differences be? And do they make one or other of those groups more reliable, in your view, than the other?
That's a great question there. Another campaign pollster, Republican named David Winston, had this great line that I heard him use a few months ago, so I'm going to steal it. And he said that a media poll is, other way, a poll done for a campaign is designed to drive a decision, where a poll done for the news media is designed to tell a story. And so they do things differently. And without diving into the methodology and the weeds of that, they are different for a good reason. They pursue different substance. They sometimes sample differently. I will say that 20 or 30 years ago, or at least when I started, there wasn't a whole lot of difference in terms of the mechanics of how a news media poll would go about doing what it did as compared to a campaign poll, at least how they would draw the sample. And if they were doing a pre-election poll, if they were interested in voters, there wasn't a huge difference. There tended to be more commonality. From my seat where I'm looking at it now, I've never seen them farther apart in approach. And I think this past election was, I think we'll get into some of those details in the hour. They've never been more different. I think everyone is challenged. I mean, who's more reliable? They're both, they've evolved into, they do different things and are more reliable for different purposes. I focus now more on the media polling, and I do worry that we may have gotten some of the story wrong in 2012. Not just being slightly off at the end, but some of the trends in the middle, and I'll leave that for
Bill,
the discussion.
let me ask Bill to jump in on this. Bill, probably more than the others on the panel, I think, continues to operate in both worlds because of the NBC Wall Street Journal poll. And most recently his firm was Mitt Romney's pollster, and in 2008, Bill was John McCain's pollster. Bill, what's your take on the difference between the two and whether one's more reliable or not?
Well, I certainly, having done the work, I certainly have better appreciation for those differences. Which is, I do NBC Wall Street Journal, I do CNBC and Economic Trends. I work with Stan, and have worked with Stan Greenberg for NPR. So we do really have our foot in both camps. And NBC Wall Street Journal, for example, we interview adults almost until June of the election year, because their job is to talk about what Americans feel, not exactly what happens in a race. And number two, as news organizations, they want to use this data to really understand how to report the campaign. What's the zeitgeist of the American electorate? What things are people looking for in candidates? What are the major issues that are driving this decision? And how do we understand what's changing about America that would affect the presidential choice? Those are those may be of interest to a campaign poll to the extent they drive a decision, but a campaign pollster is not worried about how do I kind of report the American zeitgeist back to the American people. And in that regard, and NBC, Wall Street Journal are just profoundly talented news organizations, but they have been very generous on air and afterwards in 2012, where both organizations felt so good about. They felt they had reported this story well because they had sort of understood how to look at the story. Those are all very different than when you're in a campaign. When you are in a campaign, you are using this tool to try to replicate, he will say this, she will say this, we will do this, we will do this. How does that boil down to how it will affect a voting decision? And there's a primacy of that provides clarity to campaign polling, but it makes it sort of a blinder. And then part of what I've been talking and writing about is, and I'm not here to speak ill of anybody, but I believe that a lot of the stuff we are doing now at NBC Wall Street Journal to look at and weight data is very different than what's going on, at least in the Republican Party, in terms of how they're making those decisions. And I think that some of the things we're doing at NBC Wall Street Journal are now working better than what has become the standard in the Republican Party of how to look at the composition of the electorate.
Anna, let me put a little different spin on the same question for you. We heard Mark say that the campaign's quote was to drive decisions. News media polls are to tell the story. Bill talked about the fact that they want to use the data to report on the campaign. Do you think from your vantage point that public polls today and the proliferation of them, we've got more than we ever had before, do you think they're informing the electorate more, or are they distorting the coverage more?
Honestly, I think they do neither. I think that there's no real value add in terms of your average voter who doesn't pay very much attention to politics in general, doesn't pay that much attention to polls, only has a vaguest sense, of what sort of what Nate Silver or Mark Blumenthal has on their aggregator websites. So I don't think the proliferation has, much impact one way or another. But I do think it has an impact on the coverage, which continues to be even more horse race focused, not just presidentially now, but not just at the Senate or gubernatorial level, but also at the congressional level, because you've got, outfits like Survey USA and PPP doing congressional polls. And so what you've done is basically had a trickle down effect of horse race coverage because of the proliferation. So it's had, I think, a big impact at different levels. And then from the perspective of a campaign, those polls end up being important to perceptions of how your campaign is doing, since we generally will not release our polls even when they're good. We may not release them. So, but we have to deal with polls that are out there, and if they're conducted in ways, which they often are, that don't very accurately reflect the electorate, sometimes it's overstating how well you're doing, and you love it because you hope people donate, and they understate, and you think, oh, I gotta trash this poll. But the journalism at the level, especially congressional, is the journalists, the reporters who report on this stuff are not that interested in understanding what's wrong with these surveys. One thing I would say about accuracy, I think when you get to below the national level, where I think media polls that are done well, like NBC Wall Street Journal and other national they're sort of the same. Democracy Corps, which is a survey that my firm does, very similar numbers to NBC Wall Street Journal. I think there's a general agreement. But I think when you get below the national, there's a lot more variation. And I think that campaign pollsters spend a lot of time trying to understand the electorate that they are polling, looking at voter files, looking at vote history, looking at similar kinds of elections. Was this an election where we had a competitive race? Was it lopsided, et cetera? And that the sampling frame that we develop will be from, be informed by vote history, will be drawn from the voter file, and our sense of what we think the electorate's going to look like. On the other hand, Survey USA or PPP, who do automated polling, will come in and do a one-night poll of whoever answers. And, often that poll is wrong. So I do think when you get below the national level, there's a lot of disparity between the media polls and the campaign polling.
Anna, you said something that I think everybody who's worked on a campaign experiences, that frequently when public polls are being released and they may be the same or contrary to what your internal polls are showing, more often when they're contrary, there is some pressure to release your polls, and we don't like doing it. I think all of us probably would agree on that, right? Mm-hmm. So, Anna, take this first, then I want to get to Mark in a second, but since you brought it up, how do you react when a campaign asks you to release a poll, even if you're winning, What's your approach when they say, well, the polls are out there saying we're losing, Anna, we got to go release a poll? How do you deal with that?
Well, first of all, if you have a good campaign, it's a collective conversation between the manager, the pollster, but the other people who are involved in the campaign, including the finance people, trying to get a sense of how, if we released it, it might, impact the campaign. And so there may be some consensus that we should do it, and I've certainly done it. I've plenty of campaigns I worked on. I worked on the Michelle Bachmann, Jim Graves race, obviously for Jim Graves, not Michelle Bachmann, and we released all of our polling, throughout and there were real reasons to do that. It actually helped with fundraising a lot. But and usually the decision about releasing is easier when the numbers are good. What's much harder is when I've had this happen, when I've had people who have numbers that are not good, and they don't quite understand that why being at 48 or 47 in a competitive district, for example, isn't a great number, and I have to persuade them not to release it because they think it's better news than I do. And I know that the powers that be in Washington won't think it's very good news, and so it's much harder to explain to somebody who's losing why you can't release their poll and that it's not going to help them. But when you're winning, it's much easier.
You mentioned, we can jump in. I think in that regard, in 2010, the Democrats obviously faced an enormously difficult cycle. They lost 63 seats. And what would happen is public polling would come out and it would show the Democrat incumbent losing, let's say like 48, 43 or 40, And then the Democrat incumbents, lots of them started releasing their own numbers, saying, look, we're ahead. It's 45-44, 44-42. And my point to Charlie Cook, who sort of writes the newsletter, I said, here's 10 straight surveys, and about 8 of the 10 prove they're going to lose if you know what you're doing. Because they're paying their own money to release data that tell very smart people like Charlie Cook their own poll, which you presume is the best it could possibly be, shows them under 45 and within margin of error in a horrible blowout cycle, which means they're going to lose. And so what Anna's talking about is these campaigns were making a decision to release what they said was more positive data that actually reinforced the enormous political trouble that those campaigns were in.
I'm going to bring Mark Mellman in on the end. I have a mantra that I've always used in campaigns, and Axe probably knows this. We all get under this pressure, and my line is always that releasing your poll numbers is for losers. If you're winning and you're confident you're winning, there should be no reason to release them, but we all have to face those pressures sometimes. But Mark, I do want to bring you in on this conversation and maybe go into a little more detail, because you did, Mark is the pollster for Harry Reid, the Senate Majority Leader, and he did his race in Nevada, I should say, against Sharon Angle.
That's how we say it in Nevada.
Yeah, against Sharon Angle in 2010. And Mark, I didn't go and look at every poll, but my recollection is pretty late in that campaign, there were a lot of polls showing Sharon Angle leading in that state. Your polling, and you had, as I recall, some pretty exquisite models about that electorate. Your polling was right. Harry Reid went on to win by, I think, almost 6 points, 5 points or so. Talk about the different pressures you faced internally in the final weeks or month of that campaign, when the public polls are saying something in a high-profile race, and it's that disparate. And how did you deal with that inside?
Well, it's a good question, Joel. I would say one way we dealt, Harry Reid would call me almost every day and say, are you sure these numbers are right, given everything we're seeing? I'd say, yes, Senator. No question in my mind. He said, well, you got a lot riding on this. I said, well, I do, but so do you, Senator. You have been more riding on it than I do. There's a lot of that kind of pressure, self-generated pressure, internally generated pressure, to make sure you really have the right numbers. And when everyone else is in one place showing we're losing and we're alone showing we're winning, it can feel a little bit lonely. But you do a lot of, Joel, as you were saying, and Bill was saying, you do a lot of testing and make sure that what you're doing is accurate and correct. But, and Ann, I think, made this point, this can have a tremendous impact on a race. It didn't in Harry Reid's case, because Harry Reid was the majority leader. He's the majority leader. He's going to be able to raise as much money as he needs to raise. But if he were even another senator, let alone a challenger, facing those kind of poll numbers, he would not have been able to raise the money that he needed to raise. He would not have been able to raise the volunteers that he needed. He would not have been able to generate the media coverage, the free media coverage that the campaign would have wanted. And that would have had a profound impact on the campaign. I've been in other situations like that as well, where for different reasons, candidates have been in public polls not doing well. Sometimes that's had a really deleterious effect. Other times when people are self-funders or have other kinds of avenues for raising money and getting volunteers and so on, it has less of an impact and you sort of prove everybody wrong. But there are those cases where the polls are wrong and actually become self-fulfilling prophecies. And that's really the scariest part of the process, because as Anna rightly said, when you get below the sort of national level, you know, as Bill said, you know, they're looking to sort of talk about the zeitgeist of America. When you're like, you know, WKW, you know, in Fargo, North Dakota, you're not interested in the zeitgeist of anything. You just want to put out a story that says this person's ahead and that person's behind. And that's all you really care about. And they don't care whether they get it right or wrong, for all intents and purposes. And it did so happen in North Dakota last time we were doing the race. The newspaper did a poll of primary voters only and released it as a general election poll, and showed us down by 10 points in a race that we were winning. And that could have an impact. And if we'd not had polling to show that that was not correct, it would have had an impact with our donors and so on. And there's a situation where we really did feel compelled to release our data, even though the poll that was done by the newspaper was really horrific. But again, there's self-fulfilling prophecies here that we have to be very careful about.
Let me, I desperately want to jump in because I live so much in this world. One, just to echo the point, never mind going below the presidential level if you're in a primary. If there's a primary election, at that point, now there's not as much media polling, although that makes it worse, and I'll explain why. A bad poll will kill fundraising. And so it's, you know, to a degree it won't in a general election. And the fact that there might only be one makes it that much harder for people like me to say, okay, here, you know, there's one weird poll, there are three others that have a different story. Odds are it's the three that are more accurate than the one. Horse race coverage, I've come to appreciate, is not sort of a decision for anyone, it's a fact of life. And I think the question is how campaigns and how journalists navigate that. And I'll tell you, one bit of data, and I get it enforced and reinforced every October of every even-numbered year. You can see it. Go into, Google has a website called Google Trends where you can see, you can just type in a search string and see how often over time people search for a word. Type in the word polls. And what you will see is this EKG-like thing that goes, if it's on a scale from 0 to 100, most of the time it's at about a 4. Except for October of presidential years where it jumps to 100 and then down, and then the off year and it jumps to about 30 and down and then up to 100 and so on. And what that tells me in part, I mean, that tells you what people think of who look for polls online think a poll is. A poll is to figure out if your candidate in a presidential election is going to win. Because a lot of, and I'll extend that to say that people who are engaged in politics and do read about it and do watch it on television are partisans. Anna's right. They're not engaged. They're the heavy information consumers, and they read it like it's sports. They want to know if their team's going to win. And particularly now in the age of the internet, we want to, you know, we follow what our audience clicks on. And I think that makes it even harder. We can talk later about, you know, what I'd suggest we do about it. But the Mark's, I hope I'm not, the conversation we had about the Reed race, am I, on the eve of that election, there were, as I recall, there were 6 public polls by 6 different pollsters that all, now this should have been a warning, magically converged around the nearly identical result. None of them had called cell phones. They were all kinds of surveys. Some of them were automated. Some of them used live interviewers. I think all of them were actually real surveys, although one of them may have been by one of these fly-by-night folks who may not have been doing the calls. But like a lot of people, I saw the consistency and didn't immediately question it. I was more concerned about other races where polls were all over the place. That was more obviously problematic. And Mark called and said, I don't know what you're seeing, but we're going to win. I said, can I put that on the record? And he said, no. But I want you to know, I think we're going to win, and our polls have us ahead. And like, well, as a journalist, that's a tough, you know, thank you. I look back on it, and I will now jump the heck all over any such phone calls. But what do I make of that information? If I can't, you know, I know the code. If any of these folks on this stage put their numbers in a press release and put their name on it and send it over, then I know they're staking their reputation on it. And maybe my editor doesn't want to run it because it's partisan, but I can report it. I can at least describe what kind of poll it is. If it's a tip and a background, it's harder. And I'm an unusual kind of reporter. Mark wasn't in a position to call most of the people covering that race. And I don't know what the answer is to that, except that now when he calls,
You believe him?
Well, that's,
I take it a lot more seriously than I did at that moment.
well, I think wearing my campaign pollster hat, this is the other thing that we're also living in a world where campaigns pay for these polls. They own it, we don't. And so, for example, one of the things that goes on now is people look at your publicly available data. They do it in the last 3 weeks before the election and then compare to the result, and they do this report measuring the accuracy of your polls. Well, number one, in a truly competitive race, something that's 3 weeks old isn't meant to be a predictor of an election result. But number two, the other thing people, we always do, here's the margin of error 95 out of 100 times. And people say, well, Bill, how do you know when it's the 5 out of 100? And what I say is because everything looks different. It just, when you look at it, that this is just an outlier. The depressing thing is when you do nightly tracking, is guess what? You do 20 days in a row times 10 campaigns, and you get a weird track. And it can be a weird track that's really bad. It can be a weird track that's really good. And normally you tell a client, like, we'll roll it in. But what will happen is our clients will pick the absolute peak of when they've had a good number, and that's what they'll release. And so in a world where everything is on the internet, you look at they'll say, and here's public opinion strategies numbers on 25 campaigns over 3 cycles and their accuracy. And what you say is, and I'm just saying, what you say is, okay, look, they own the poll, they had every right to release it, but I have this story. Let me just do a show of hands by generation. How many people here know who Carl Sagan is? Could you raise your hand? What a literate crowd here at the University of Chicago. I am so impressed.
It is the University of Chicago, after all.
It is the University of Chicago. But Carl Sagan was a sort of a popularizer of science, and he wrote this wonderful thing that I loved about porpoises and their special relationship with man. And he talked about that over 240 years, there were 317 reported episodes of porpoises pushing sailors into the shore and saving their lives. And this special bond. And then the next, Carl did all this stuff. The next month, there was somebody who actually did porpoise research for a living. And he wrote, "Dear Carl, porpoises like to push things with their nose. That's what they do for fun. We did not hear from the 317 sailors that decided to push out to sea over 215 years." And so my point to people is, even when I do a press conference, they go, "Bill, every time we see you, it's happy news for your client." And I'll say, I don't survive on the 5 polls I do in a year. I'm here because this was the push into sea poll. But there's no question that as a pollster, that's what's happening when our stuff does get released. There is that truth about the 2010 Democrat story, but almost always campaigns are picking whatever's the one little window that's the most positive number, and they own it. And by the way, I'm not saying the number's wrong, but it can leave a very different impression aggregate over 3 cycles compared to your stuff.
This actually happened to me last year. I was doing tracking in a race every single night, and the campaign released the best 3-day average, even though if you looked at over the course of it, it was mostly right. I mean, most days were right. And I later, 6 months later, saw something about that inaccurate Greenberg poll, and I was like, no, it wasn't. I really wanted to release the entire month of data so you could see that they had taken the best 3 nights in a row and averaged them and put it out, but there's nothing you can do about it. You own it if it has your name on it, so.
It's right, just a similar kind of experience. We were doing tracking, so happens in Nevada, again, and this last time, and for a client that wanted to have the best showing for President Obama as possible in the state. And we were tracking every night, and they picked the nights that we were going to release it, and they were the best nights. And we had one, I think, was 8 or 9, plus 8 or 9, which I knew was way too, meaningfully too high. But they had released it, and I said, we mostly had the +6, I think it ended up being, or 5, 6. And I said, look, we've got to release this, I'm just because I don't want this 9 being out there, from 2 weeks ago. And they let me do it. But it's a battle. I mean, and the truth is, your reputation can be affected by that in serious ways.
Let me go back to the public polls and at the national level. Some of you said that you think it gets diluted when you go down below the national level. So I went online before when I was preparing for this panel a bit, And I looked at Real Clear Politics, where they, have an average. I hate poll averages, I'll tell you that from the start. I always say the average of good science and bad science isn't better science. Half the people thought the earth was flat, half thought it was round. There was an objective reality somewhere there. Wasn't necessarily a semicircle, right? But in the last 20 polls, from November 20th to November 5th, on Real Clear Politics, pretty close into the election, 7 polls had the race tied, 5 polls had Romney with a lead, 5 polls had Obama with a 1-point lead, 2 had him with a 3-point lead, and 1 had him with a 5-point lead. And on December 23rd, after the election, Mark, to put you on the hot seat, you wrote on your blog, elections were regarded as a victory for pollsters and poll aggregators. So when I look at a period of 20 polls over a 2-week span, right, leading up to the election, the one thing I know about all those polls is they're not all right. So tell me why you think they had a good, it was a victory for pollsters and poll aggregators.
Well, I get to read points 1 and 2 on
there
my
you go.
notes now.
He's got his notes. I wanted him to get to his notes.
Because I did write that. And so on the one hand, in a period when polling is as challenged now, telephone polling in particular is as challenged as it has been at any point in my career. It is facing, I don't know if crisis is the right word, but it's at a very sort of existential moment in terms of how we do these things. Most polls had Obama ahead, and the candidate who was ahead won. And that line, whenever I wrote it, was a recognition of there was this battle during the campaign of do we believe the polls or not, and those who were on the side of believe them, and that includes, most importantly, not aggregators and other people who got famous, but the people who actually did the work. Without that underlying polling, we would have had nothing to aggregate. But on the other hand, is the point Joel's making, which is that most national surveys understated President Obama's margin. Most of the surveys, or at least the averages in the battleground states, understated the president's lead. And I think more important than that, I mean, if you, well, we'll set aside the scoring at the end. The way pollsters sort of traditionally do this is we look at the very last poll or the poll in the last week, and we compare that to the election for perfectly sound theoretical reasons. That's when people have made their minds up. And in the past, polling has been, I mean, the point Bill made, if you look at a poll that's 2 or 3 weeks old, there's all kinds of things can happen. But what's interesting about this race is that I saw 2 different stories told. There was one in particular, and I am not thinking of the NBC Wall Street Journal poll in particular, because you all only had 2 of them, like most national surveys. I'm thinking of the folks who were tracking. There was a story of a sort of collapse of Obama's lead after the first debate, of a move of about 5 points on the margin, depending on the poll, and then a very, very close race during much of October, and then this sort of mini surge at the end that had a couple of national polls get it sort of right, and Gallup came back to close. And so that's one story. And there's another story that I see if I look at, well, from what I've heard of the internal Obama campaign polling and what we've reported about it, from YouGov, which is a pollster that doesn't do random sampling, they do internet sampling, but they have a method of controlling for what we would call response bias, and others who did that, who did not see, who saw a little bit of bump up for Romney after the first debate, maybe more like on the order of a point or 2, and then no change with Obama ahead for most of October. Now, one of those stories isn't right. And I suspect I could go on for the whole hour, so I'll wrap this. But I think what is happening is that at least there's probable cause to look into whether the people we're able to interview, because they're reachable or because they've cooperated, may be changing over the course of the campaign and distorting who is ahead or behind at any given moment. We call that non-response bias. That there may have been in that period after the first debate, and I think both the Obama campaign and YouGov has told me they have evidence of this, that it was easier to interview Republicans for a week or 2 than it was to interview Democrats. And that may have created this trend. I can't say that I have proof of that, but I think we have enough cause to look into it more closely.
Just, Anna wants to jump in, just as the Obama pollster campaign, because I've been saying this all week on campus, our polling was virtually static from September 4th, before our convention, through Election Day, with the only significant variance, and we basically had a 3 to 4 point lead in every poll. Our only variance, our biggest variation came after the 47% tape. Those voters drifted back. We saw a very steady trend line all the way through the fall. Anna, you wanted to jump in on
Sure.
that.
Well, I mean, for a client that I have, we did nightly tracking for the entire year, and we used national voter file with cell interviewing and Spanish language, so that even though we weren't collecting a lot of data every night the data we collected was done with sort of an eye to making sure that we had the right kind of racial and ethnic composition, the right number of young people, and we had a very stable line also. We had there was, sort of very small but real improvement for the president from kind of Aiken through 47%, and there was definitely an impact of that second debate, but it came back pretty quickly. In the last 3 weeks of October, he was consistently, ahead. When I look at the national polls and the ones that, where you had a lot of variation, like a Gallup especially, but others, I think we just have to look at how they conduct their surveys and what kind of resources they put to making sure they get the right people in their surveys. And it's not enough just to have cell phone interviews. You have to do the right number of callbacks. You have to look at sort of geographically where, folks are from. I mean, the thing with cell phone interviewing is you can't be as precise with geographic quotas as you can with landline interviewing. So you have to be really careful around portability and other issues with understanding the geographic distribution of cell phone interviewing. So I think that the polls that got it right were probably the most rigorous in making sure the quality of their sample would reflect, what the electorate was going to look like. But a lot of these public polls, especially the ones that aren't sort of, have the highest standards, don't want to spend that kind of money. It costs a lot more money to do that kind of polling.
So I want to get to some of the rigorous sampling, and I want to touch on 2 areas, but I want to tell a quick anecdote first, because there are 2 things that are being kicked around, some by Bill, who has spent a lot of time looking at this and shared his view on one aspect of likely voter samples with those of us on the panel the other day. There's a question about party ID and partisanship in polls. The standard practice in polling and the way it's taught is that you can't weight party identification because it's an attitudinal variable. I did an exercise here, I won't repeat it, about whether or not people actually do change their party ID in a narrow span of time. But the anecdote is this: one of the most reputable public polling outlets that I consider reputable, in March of 2012, released a poll with a headline that said, "With gas prices high, Obama's lead disappears." And he went from a 7-point lead to a 1-point deficit. Now, from their previous poll 4 weeks earlier, this most significant change in the poll was a narrowing in their split on party ID from +10 Democrat to +4 Democrat. 4 weeks later, the headline from the same outlet said, "With gas prices nudging $4 a gallon, there's pain at the pump, but no recriminations for Obama. He leads by 6. And no acknowledgement anywhere that what had happened was the party ID actually drifted back to what they considered their normal poll. So the exercise I did the other night, here in this room, I'll do it. It's a mixed group here, it's not just students. But think of whatever party you identify with right now, Democrat, Independent, or Republican. Just get it in your head, don't want to know it. How many of you in the last 10 years considered yourself a member of one of the other 2 parties? Put your hand up, please. About 4 or 5 people out of somewhere around 100. Pretty low percentage of change. In some of these polls, this would be a dramatic shift in what we know is a predictor of vote. In some cases, it would mean that in the last month, 6 million people decided they weren't Democrats anymore. They were now independents. How should pollsters, both publicly and professionally, deal with that variation on a variable that we know correlates highly to how a person's going to vote? Bill, you want to kick that off?
Yeah. I talked to my buddy Mark Mellman one time in one cycle where Gallup had, this is I think the 2000 cycle. Gallup in July said party ID was like +7 Democrat. 3 weeks later they had +6 Republican, and then weeks later it was back to Democrat. And I said to Mark, what would you do in your phone center if in the space of 2 months you had that kind of party variation? And Mark actually gave a really coherent answer. He said we would rip through everything, re-go through training. I mean, he had a coherent answer for what you would do. The point is party ID does shift. It does change over time, but it doesn't bounce 7 points back and forth in 2 months. And the painful answer when you read the work about interest in the election, this and this and this, that's not possible. It doesn't happen. You know, and what I say to people to prove it doesn't happen is, let's look at the signal event in America really in, you know, which is in this century, which is 9/11. Party ID changed modestly. And I said at the time, this will last 6 months, maybe. But you know, this is as big as the event gets, and Party ID nudged Republican. It didn't shift Republican, it nudged. So my point to people is if 9/11 doesn't dislodge partisanship more than that nudge, what in the world do you think happened in 2 months that would bounce Party ID like that? So the answer is nothing. So one of the things that we do, and this is something I'm committed to, is NBC Wall Street Journal, we ask you your self-described vote for the previous election. And we project actual, you know, what people tell us as voters, we project the winner's margin. So every NBC Wall Street Journal poll, and actually here's the other thing we do at NBC Wall Street Journal. I read a poll critique that talked about too much weighting. We are spending a fortune to set quotas so that we have to interview 10% have to be African-American interviews, 7% at least have to be Latino. You have to have 15% 18 to 29. You have to have gender equal by state. You have to do this. It costs a fortune to do those kind of quotas these days in a phone center, but it means we do very minimal weighting because we're interviewing to quota. What it also means is that, like Obama, that Obama's number in most any NBC Wall Street Journal poll in 2012, if you looked at actual self-described voters, Obama's self-described vote would be between like 49 to 53% in 2008. Meaning it's a very narrow band. I mean, there's poll-to-poll variation, but it's not like we have a sample where Obama's vote is 56% self-described from 08 and the next poll it's 45. And when you do that, party ID varies, but it doesn't radically vary. And I've been asked, do you ever weight party ID in NBC Wall Street Journal? And I have to say yes. Because like two times in the 8 years I've been doing this, we weighted party because it was so unusual. 2 times in 8 years does not make me feel dirty. You know, that's pretty low for weighting party. But because we have a known variable, which is your self-described reported vote, and because that gap in that variable is pretty constant given the way we do interviewing, then the other thing, and this is, again, where I was, I think in late September, we had this ludicrous kind of conservative effort to reweight every poll because the polls are wrong and blah, blah, blah. You know, I mean, again, that's nuts. And you cannot, you know, just because the historic average is X or the average in 2010 was Y doesn't have any bearing on where Americans have to be in this cycle. Now, you know, we're going to talk, and my point was I do think something very important happened. And Democracy Corps had the race at 4 points in their last poll. But the polling average is Obama 1 point. Nate Silver's estimate was 2.5 points. I do think something happened that took what was in the polls an average of a point to 2 points to make it 4. And understanding what happened to add 2 points is actually, to me, an important thing that needs to be understood. I don't think that's insignificant. And that's what my concern is and what I'd like to do better in my job trying to figure out.
So, Bill, I want to get to, you know, some of the stuff you sent to us the other day in a minute, because it is another piece of the equation, which is likely voter samples. But for the rest of the panel, so Mark, given your experience in races where the public polls were off, and we've all seen these where party ID is frequently, we probably know, is what the swing is really a result of, how should those public polling entities treat that? And how should reporters covering it treat it?
Well, that's a good question. There are 2 different kinds of states. There are states that have party registration, and there are states that don't. The states that have party registration are pretty easy because there is then a known quantity. It is not the same thing as party identification. One is a legal concept, how'd you fill out the form? The other is a psychological concept, how do you feel? They're not the same thing. But there is something known about party registration. And when you have party registration and you have data on past elections and other kinds of data that are helpful in this respect, you can do a pretty good job of figuring out what that partisan mix in terms of registration should be, and the party ID should take care of itself. And if it doesn't, there's really something wrong with what you're doing. that goes back several steps earlier. In the states that don't have party registration, it's really much more complicated. And one of the advantages that we have is, as campaign pollsters, at least in some campaigns, is we're doing multiple polls. So we have a database to work on, and we have some sense of overall, when you get not to just a sample of 600, but you get 1,800 or 2,000 or 3,000 interviews, what does that party identification look like? You don't have as much sample variation and so on. And then you can also make a judgment about what party identification ought to be. If you're a media poll and you just have the one sample of 500 that you do, and you don't have any registration data to deal with, you got a much more complicated situation. But I think it is, Joel, as you pointed out, when it's clear that the variation is a result of changing party ID, if reporters don't report that, I think they're doing a fundamental disservice to the public, but also, to my mind, they're violating, you're the former reporter, but it seems to me that they're violating their ethical obligation. Because if you know, as you said, these days, and it wasn't always as true as it is today, but these days, vote is so highly correlated with partisanship that if the party ID is changing in the poll and you're not reporting that, you're really misleading people.
Mark, you're diligent about reporting that when that occurs in polls. You talk to reporters all the time, journalists. You know, is there some way to get some meeting of the minds about how those kinds of variations in polls get covered? Or is this just something that we're going to have more polling, more variations, and everybody being confused about what they really say?
Yeah, a couple of things. One, when I said at the outset that I thought that the world of campaign pollsters and the world of media pollsters has never been more far apart, this is one of the things which they're separate. The sort of approach that Bill laid out in using a retrospective vote question as a way to sort of cap some of the variation is something my media colleague, most of the other media pollsters, I think would just be aghast at. Take a look, a small anecdote, and then a more broad point. If you go pull up the Pew Research final survey from just before the election, get their questionnaire, look at the back, they ask a retrospective vote question just like this, and they report it among all registered voters. Now, few in the media world are as rigorous and spend as much money to get a quality sample of adults on the phone. They have no peer. I think they probably spend as much or more than anybody else. And they're, watch what they do and copy it if you want to learn how to sample. But look at that question, and you will see during 2011 and 2012, about a half a dozen times they asked it, the quote-unquote margin for Obama over McCain was about 12 points. Yes, I know that's way too big. That's not what it was, but we know that. That's 60 years of survey research tells us that some people forget who they voted for when it was the person who didn't win, and they remember voting when they didn't, whatever. But it should be constant, as Bill said. But look at the first survey after the first debate, and that 13-point advantage became a 5-point advantage. And that persisted into their second survey about October 20th. And it wasn't until their last survey, the one on which Obama was ahead by 3 points, that it went away. So I think that supports the argument Bill made. I want to just say sort of more broadly that when we talk about what makes a survey scientific, which I don't think any of us love as a descriptor, what makes it rigorous, we always think about the way it's a random probability sample, the kind of rigor that pollsters typically think about is what Anna was referring to. And that's right. That's an important part of the process. We don't tend to think about that way about what happens on the other end. That is, when I started, 25 years ago, you could do all the, run a rigorous sample, and you didn't have to weight that data very much. It was magical how close it came. Now, forget it. It doesn't matter how you start. You are getting a pool of unrepresentative biased data that you have to fix one way or another, by weighting, by the way you stratify, by the way you pick people. And there is a great deal of rigor in what the folks on this stage do that's just not thought of that way. If you look at the PowerPoint that Bill sent to us that was sort of published, I think, or will be public, it's not necessarily reflective of what all campaign pollsters do, but it is very rigorous. And I don't know, you will see in it the mindset of the people on the stage and how they approach that problem. And it's something that media pollsters don't do much of.
So let me call out to everybody. There's a microphone here in this middle aisle, and if you have questions about any of the subjects we've talked about or others, if you want to line up by the microphone, we'll start taking questions.
As I do want to say, again, the folks at Gallup are very smart. I made one comment about an example in 2000. They appointed their own methodology committee to look at what they're doing. I'm sure that the results of that will be open and transparent. Gallup, Pew are two organizations that get enormous credit in my mind for being transparent. But the Gallup guy in the list raised a really important question to me. He said, you know what, because they're doing daily tracking. And daily tracking means you're getting a sample of people you can get that evening on the phone. And I'm becoming more and more convinced that the people you can get any one night in the phone are becoming so much less representative. And I believe that I've been advantaged at NBC Wall Street Journal by the longer calling period. And that I believe in a major campaign, we're going to get to the point where you might have to, in a campaign, do night-to-night tracking to pay attention to media and stuff. But over layering it will be a week-long, large sample survey with a huge multiple attempts and multiple callbacks, because I think you get a depth of sample you no longer can do in tracking. And my confidence in tracking is very different today than it was 2 years ago and radically different than it was 6 years ago.
Just for what it's worth, when we do tracking, we treat it that way. In other words, we're doing callbacks. We're doing many more callbacks when we're doing nightly tracking than we're doing on any other survey, because we're calling people that we called 4 weeks ago and couldn't get and have called every night since. So we're trying to actually use the daily tracking to fix the problem.
Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I mean, I now won't do, a nightly track that's as a standalone sample. I'll have basically, a complete sample over 3 nights and another complete sample over 3 nights. And because I've just found the night-to-night calling is so erratic.
I was going to say, Anna, the same thing. I called Mark during the campaign at one point. I said, are you still doing nightly tracking the way you always do it? Because I've been doing it the way Anna does it to try to offset that, and I think it works pretty well. Let's get a first question here from the audience.
Hi. First of all, as a physics major, thank you so very much for quoting Carl Sagan. I would like to ask about, in the polling process, how much of it is from a strategic standpoint in terms of choosing the questions or choosing the samples or whatever, and how much of it is the sheer data quenching part, and how are these two parts, or are they just like so interrelated with each other there is no way to completely separate them? And on the related note, I guess this affects campaign polling more than public polling. Data on its own could be blind and sheerly objective, but we know that the way we process data, and especially in the process of polling, sometimes we devise specific methods to drive a narrative in order to achieve specific results, especially when you're running helping out a campaign. How effective is that, and how does that potential advantage weigh against the potential danger of tainting the credibility of numbers? Thank you.
Can I take it?
You want to start, Anna, and then Mark Mellman maybe jump in?
The first question is really interesting because I actually think from the perspective of the campaign, and that includes everybody who's involved, other consultants, for example, the media consultant, the mail consultant, everybody who has any kind of input on what you're doing spends far more time on the construction of the survey instrument, not necessarily in a helpful way, by the way. So you also spend time fighting what people want to do, but they're really focused on it. And really focused on often some of the wrong things, like one word in a 20-minute survey. They think that's really important, that word be very, be one thing when you know that people are half listening to the poll and it really doesn't matter what the word is. But then the pollster is kind of the magician who does the data analysis and sort of presents it, and it's sort of taken, at face value. And there are some campaigns and some other consultants who read the crosstabs, but most don't. And I would argue there is less time spent on the data analysis piece, especially when you're in sort of tracking season and you're just trying to report the top line number and what we should do next and let's make a decision. But I think that's changing. And I think that the sheer availability of data, and not just the data that we collect, but consumer data, the data on voter files, the companies that have aggregated that data and you can buy it, the proliferation of data has actually made it, in some ways, there's more to work with. And I think has actually enhanced the role of data analysis in the work that we do. So whether that's doing modeling to try to use polling data plus consumer data and vote history data to model the electorate in certain ways, which have become a very big part of Democratic campaigns anyway. It's one way, for example, to deal with a state that doesn't have party registration. So you use modeled party as opposed to the actual registration, and it's pretty accurate. There's also, I think, been more focus on multivariate analysis, which I think has not been true in the past. So I think that there is actually more attention and more depth to data analysis now than there ever has been. And it's a function, I think, of kind of the availability of data beyond just kind of the poll that tends to often be relatively straightforward in how you interpret it. And it's allowed us, I think, to do many more things, many more creative things, and actually work much more closely with, people on, just as an example, I mean, it's amazing. In the congressional races I worked on, the modeling that was done on the voter file allowed us to track in real time early vote and what the modeled vote, what we thought their vote would be for the early voters, and it allowed us to adjust our sampling as we were polling to make sure that what we had was a sample of people who hadn't voted yet. And that kind of information is just, there's treasure trove. And so I think it's actually becoming a much bigger part of what we do. But from the campaign perspective, and the people on the campaign, they really focus on the construction of the instrument and less so on the data side.
So let me try and take a slightly different cut at your question, which may or may not be responsive, but it'll be a different cut. There's one layer that's about accuracy, and that's really what we've been talking about importantly up till now, for the most part. And the truth is, without an accurate reading of public opinion, everything else is going to fall apart. You're unlikely to make good strategic decisions if you don't have an accurate reading of public opinion. So the first layer is getting the numbers right. Okay, but that is as important as that is. It's sort of the sine qua non. You can't be without it. Most of the sort of effort is really spent on the analytics side. That is using that data to make strategic decisions. And so, and some of that is done through just filtering the numbers through experience. Some of that is done through very sophisticated analysis of the data. Some of it's done in lots of different ways. But there are a lot of, you're analyzing that data with the objective of affecting the campaign strategy. What's the message? What are you saying? Who are you saying it to? When are you saying it? Through what media are you saying it? Those sort of core strategic questions are the questions you want to be answering with these data. And the analysis, again, hopefully very sophisticated analysis, is driving you to that point. But it's all based on sort of having an accurate reading of what public opinion is. Let me just use that for a second, if you don't mind. We always tell our clients to answer the question they want to answer, not the question they were asked. So let me just do that for 1 second. And it goes to the point that was made before. When we talk about accuracy, somebody said a moment ago, the typical thing that we do is look at the last survey that was done by whoever and say, if they were close to the final result, they're accurate, and if they weren't, they weren't. Okay, that is only part of the picture. I mean, yes, you want to be right in that sense. But, and I'll give you an example from nearby. That we did Jim Doyle's race for governor a couple years ago in Wisconsin. And the question is, what is the story that those data tell? I think someone was alluding to this before. And they can tell very different stories. And somebody's right about that story and somebody's wrong about that story. So the story that the public data told in Jim Doyle's race was that you had Jim Doyle, the incumbent governor, run against a congressman who represented a fairly isolated media market, Green Bay. And the public data would say they started out tied, essentially, and over time, the Republican congressman fell behind and we moved ahead. Okay? The story that our data would say is the governor started about here, the unknown congressman started about here, and got up to a certain point, never got any higher. Well, it's just on the logic of it, which seems like a more reasonable story. Hint, ours is the more reasonable story. Okay? And the other story is frankly absurd. I mean, it's absurd on its face. Yet, at the end of the campaign, we had the right numbers, the public polls had the right numbers, everybody had the right numbers, but along the way, they weren't right. And they couldn't have been right, because it doesn't even make sense. The story they're telling doesn't make any sense. So being right at the end is not the same thing as being right all the way through.
Right. Let's get to the next question. We've got a few people lined up. Thank you.
Hello. I was interested, thanks. When you all were talking about your path to where you got to polling, it seemed that a lot of you were very highly informed about politics, about like the national picture versus really small races in North Dakota. But of course, many of the people that you poll don't have that same relationship with politics. So I was kind of wondering, like, with all the time you spend trying to ask strategic questions, how have you started to understand how these people think about politics? Like, what's their relationship with it like, and how does it differ from yours?
So just
Significantly.
since I bypassed mine, I just want to assure you quickly that long before being a pollster, I was worked in avant-garde theater, and I was a beer distributor in Crown Heights in Brooklyn. Until I was 30, in fact. So, but it's a great question. Bill, you want to jump in
Yeah,
on
because
that?
I was going to say, again, in terms of how much, we influence each other, Mark and I had lunch after the 1992 campaign, and I said something about how many focus groups did your firm did, and I remember the numbers like 155. Our firm had done 6. And we just didn't do a lot of qualitative research. And so I went back to my partners and say, look, we're missing the boat. So to answer your question, our firm does a huge chunk of qualitative research. And I think one way that online has helped is online, and big data has been another huge way for us to look at unfiltered opinion. And so that qualitative research has been one transformational thing in my career in terms of how I look at and approach stuff, because you were spending so much time listening to people. And in that regard, it is scary. Most often when I speak, there's not even like a door in the back. There's like a closed room with no windows. And I tell people, remember, anybody who would spend an hour listening to this with closed doors and windows has nothing in common with anybody in the electorate that matters. Because, as I said, they're busy doing their real life. And for most people, we do this all the time. For most people, their real life is, I've got to make a decision about voting for president. When do I do that? There's about 2 weeks left, 3 weeks left. They tune in, and that's my other point. I always say Americans are not well informed, but they're not stupid. I have enormous trust and confidence in the body politic, and I think they acquire information when they believe it's needed, and they acquire the information they believe they need to make a decision. The point is, those two decisions are radically different than the decision you wish maybe people would make, or that you think about as a hard partisan. But one of the questions that I ask this not so much in partisan in my other work is, do you think like on our initiatives, do you think you know enough about this information, do you think you know enough about this initiative to make an informed decision? And you can watch the percent saying yes. And they might not know any more factual stuff, but when that yes gets to a tipping point, they've got enough information, they're going to make a decision. That process of learning that people tune in when they have to, and they acquire the information they think they need, those are helpful insights to me. And then I'm saying they're always informed by a huge amount of qualitative research. And then, and lastly, my partner Peter Hart in the NBC poll was doing this in the 1960s, and he gave a speech at Roper. He got like a lifetime award, and he said, people forget, when I first started in this, the actual questionnaire was usually 1/3 to 1/2 open ends. And we would no more do that today, and Peter is saying that we need to allow people to speak for themselves. And already, even in the first two surveys after the election in NBC Wall Street Journal, you can already see us trying to re-inject, not half, not even, but you can see us trying to re-inject open ends back into this process so that unfiltered voice doesn't get lost.
Just add one thought, that I think your question sort of identified what I think is the most important role of the folks on this panel, which is to bring to the campaign and to the campaign strategy the very thing you were talking about, how ordinary people who aren't obsessed with politics, who don't live inside the Beltway, think about it. And the trick is, if you're designing a survey with a lot of closed-ended questions, if your assumptions are off, then you will inevitably confirm assumptions or be confused or miss the truth. And I always found that while qualitative research, a focus group, isn't a random sample, can be very misleading, can be thrown off by one loud person, I found them so valuable in dispelling my misconceptions that came from reading the Washington Post every day. And it's the one thing I miss the most now that I don't get to go watch them every other month.
And before we take the next question, I just want to do my bit for the Institute of Politics and my friend and colleague David Binder, who's going to be here over the next few days starting tonight. David Axelrod mentioned him in his introduction. He did all of the focus groups during the Obama campaign. And we also did some innovative things online. Both Binder did some, I did some. We had communities online that he may talk about during the week in very real time, a body of people who were there for a few weeks at a time, and we could touch base with them periodically. We did, again, to the point about online work, we did what we called loosely an ethnography project, all open-ended questions, 6 times over a 16-day period with 100 swing voters, and very in-depth questions, written like a journalist would with follow-up questions embedded, and they would answer these questions, eight each night, and we had 1,400 pages of transcripts from 100 people at the end of the 6 sessions. Because it is, if we don't keep in touch with that, the quantitative data won't work. You have to use that language and what you learn from those folks.
Well,
Very brief event. Oh, go ahead,
I mean,
sorry.
you have a real responsibility because surveys, public opinion is a social construct, and it's a combination of people's core preferences, what's sort of out there, what they're hearing, but also how you word the question. And you're shaping how people answer it. And so if you come to it with a set of assumptions about how people think about something, you're going to get a particular answer, and it's measuring something. It's not false. It's just measuring the way you think about it. The reason why I say it's a real responsibility, and I can only speak for myself, but I have a fair number of clients who don't want to actually find out what people actually know as a starting point, which is usually very little. And then what they, in as objective a way as you can possibly be, knowing it's a subjective experience, what people really think, that they want to have the information provided in the way that they see the world. And so I find, especially with my ideological issue advocacy clients, not so much my candidates, that there's a constant sort of push back on, hey, people don't think about this the same way you, in fact, we may not even know how people think about it. So it's kind of the pollster's responsibility to make sure that we're attuned to that, because no one else is going to do it.
Just very briefly.
Go ahead.
We're very weird, and we recognize we're very weird. And if we didn't recognize we were very weird, we would not do our jobs well. We, however, do recognize we're weird. A lot of our clients don't recognize how weird they are, and our job is to explain to them how weird they are.
Go ahead, sir.
Okay. So you all have actually anticipated my question, but I think it's still worth asking. I'm reminded of the old adage, all politics is local. And we've been talking a lot about the presidential elections, but I'm really intrigued about the idea of, congressional polling and the balance you may have to strike between quantitative and qualitative. The quirks of a district, the way it's been gerrymandered, the way certain local issues. So how do you balance that in doing those sorts of polls, in constructing questions, or do you have to really strike a fine balance between what local knowledge and the work that you're doing?
Anna, you do a lot of House races,
Yeah.
right?
Well, I think that issue is actually more of a problem when you do state and local polling versus congressional, because there's a sort of core level of there's a core of federal issues that you're always going to be looking at in congressional races, whether it's immigration or abortion or whatever it is. And there'll be, certain districts will have its own character, and it means that they will have a certain view about those issues, but you're still going to ask those questions, because particularly as there's more and more money, at the level, these super PACs at the congressional level, these races are nationalized and very partisan. And so if you're not asking those questions, no matter what the character of the district is, you still have to ask those questions. That being said, every district has its own, zeitgeist, right? And so, for example, I did Gabby Gifford's polling, and now I do Ron Barber's polling. That district, before Gabby was shot, had a very distinct character, but after, even more challenging to think about how you run in that district. And so you have to have that infused in the survey you're writing, and the way you know about it is you read the newspaper clips every day. Well, that sounds so quaint, newspaper clips. You read the coverage of not just the race itself, but what's happening with the Rosemont mine, or what's happening with the people being shot along the border, right? So and then you're talking to people, right? So you're in constant conversation and communication. If you're, and it's hard because most of us have more than one client, and you could do that sort of full time for each one. I would say it's even harder if you do gubernatorial or state legislative work, because then everything is very particular to that state. And some states are somewhat easier than others because a state like Maine is less diverse than a state like Pennsylvania. But it's the same process. You have to follow the news, and you have to talk to people there, and you have to have the people you work with alert you when something's happening. And so, I'd say like a third of my job is reading clips, and it's sometimes very boring. But But if you're not sort of up on what's happening, day to day in these places, it's very hard then to write a survey to kind of reflect the particularities of that race.
One thing I'd throw in really briefly is that the differences in polling in a congressional race versus a presidential race or whatever, statewide race, are minor compared to just the simple differences in politics. The one mistake I think students of politics make when they go out and become active in campaigns is to assume that all politics work like presidential campaigns do, and to apply all the lessons that you've learned by watching the Obama campaign or the McCain campaign, whatever. And they're completely different in that everyone follows the presidential campaign. Everyone knows the candidates. They're household names, whereas in most congressional races, most people don't know much of anything about the candidates. They might know their name. A completely different world.
Thank you.
We get to the next question, please.
You may all be familiar with the debate in political science about whether campaigns actually do anything. And that's particularly at the presidential level, where you can fairly accurately predict the result based on national conditions like the economy. And you've mentioned in some races that you were working on where there was a pretty steady line through the whole campaign. So I'm just curious, in your past experience, when and where you have found campaigns to actually make a difference.
Can I just jump in first before my colleagues take my privilege as a moderator? I don't think it's true that you can accurately predict the outcome of a presidential campaign. At the beginning of the campaign, all the pundits were writing President Obama would lose about a year out. Forecasters were writing. Even Nate Silver had a piece in the magazine section in the New York Times headlined, "Is Obama Toast?" People wrote that no incumbent president had been reelected with an unemployment rate higher than 7.2%. That was true. The right track, wrong track number was at about 30% right track. Horrific number, as Neil Newhouse told us the other night, for any incumbent. The Michigan Consumer Confidence Sentiment Index, which Bill McInturf has spent a lot of time looking at, no incumbent had ever been reelected with that number below 78%. But for each of those, there was a different context at work that actually allowed us, David Axelrod, the strategy team, to see a path to winning. And so campaigns do matter. It was clear that none of those were dispositive. When you look at the Michigan Consumer Confidence Sentiment, Bill was right. But Barack Obama was also on his election day the president elected with the lowest consumer sentiment in history. The previous president who got elected with 7.2% was Ronald Reagan. And before him, the level was 5.4%. So Albert Einstein said something once, that every theory is true until future conditions prove it wrong. I think campaigns and candidates do matter. Mark, Bill, what do you guys say?
Well, I say Mark's client, Heidi Heidkamp, is that her?
Heidkamp.
Heidkamp in North Dakota. The point is, if you do what we do for a living, all of us could tell you a story about a candidate who won who shouldn't, because the candidate quality dragged a campaign that shouldn't have won to win. Because I'm a structuralist. I actually believe that large structure of the vote is set, but I also believe powerfully that unique candidates can drag a campaign over the finish line and win. And conversely, there have been candidates who should not have lost who did, because mistakes matter. And so I don't think we start a presidential race with everything's up for grabs. I think there are powerful structures that determine vote, but at the margins, candidates matter, and they matter hugely. And when there is, and again, Heidi's an example. I mean, there's no way she should have won North Dakota if you just look at every national number, but she did. And I have my own examples of candidates who should never have won and did. And then, the other thing, and I've read a lot about the presidential models, is what tends to happen is the people publish the range of what could happen. Here's our 4 ranges, then what the election happens, and one of the 4 was right. It's very rare that these people publish the exact right one projectively for every cycle. But as I said, I'm a representative of unique and talented candidates can drag a campaign forward.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at, let me go back to the Abby Giffords example, because it's really, I think, a perfect example of how campaigns matter. So in March of 2010, we did a poll. We hadn't polled since 2008, and she, very popular, won by decent margin, very popular, and she was at 40%. And Now, part of that was just what was going to happen in 2010. Part of it was just sort of the national conditions dragging her down. It was sort of astonishing, though, to all of us. We went and did focus groups, sort of figured out what we thought was wrong. And then, because she's a prolific fundraiser, we went on the air in June, all positive bio, heavy focus on immigration and veterans. She also, this was her conviction, but she also played a very prominent role when Arizona passed SB 1070, sort of really an incredible hat trick, which was to be against 1070, but defending Arizona. Because Raul Grijalva, who was the member next door, had come out and said we should boycott Arizona. So she came out against the boycott. It was on Fox News, we're against the boycott. So we neutralized, the immigration issue. It's a big Tea Party immigration district. The point is that we ended up winning in the end by 4,000 votes. We were one of 3 people who got reelected in districts that McCain won. And I believe that if we had not started the campaign in June and reintroduced her and talked a lot about immigration and veterans and military, I think she would have been one of the folks who went down. I would also say, and this is, I think, very much kind of the way the Obama campaign worked as well, the field operation was totally data-driven. It was an amazing early vote operation. We won in the early vote. We lost on election day. It's not a political science study that's testing different conditions and showing where they matter and don't matter. But I think that those are rare campaigns, but they demonstrate or they prove why campaigns matter so much.
Great. Well, let me file a slightly mild dissent here. Look, campaigns and candidates can matter, but usually they don't. I mean, I've been doing this for 30 years, and I can find examples, and Bill's kind enough to mention Heidi Heitkamp, and that's a great example, and there's others, and we can all find these examples where the campaigns and the candidates made a difference. But most of the time, they don't. And I'd say that to my clients about races I've been in. They pay me for it, and the truth is, if they hadn't paid me for it, they still would have won or lost, like 90-odd% of the time. And the truth is, there are certain structural conditions that matter, and matter a lot. Not every indicator is the right indicator. I mean, there is a certain astrological politics that we go through, like this. No president's ever been reelected with 7.2% unemployment. That's true, and as Joel said, the last one who got elected with, before Ronald Reagan was reelected with 5.2 or 5.4, whatever it was, nobody had been reelected with unemployment that high. But he won 49 states, for God's sakes. So there really isn't any consistent relationship between unemployment rates and electoral outcomes. That doesn't mean there's no relationship between economic performance and political outcomes. It just means that's not a very good indicator of what the economic conditions are that drive the political outcomes. And I would say, frankly, the same thing is true with respect to consumer confidence. I mean, people have gone through and studied these things. There are some things that are better indicators than others of what it is, what's related to the presidential outcomes or congressional outcomes. And look, in congressional and House races, it's pretty damn easy. 95% get reelected, okay? That's pretty straightforward. Now, are you telling me that if they didn't have the consultants, they wouldn't have won, or they didn't have the campaigns or a different candidate? No, of course they would have won most of the time. And the truth is, both sides have the consultants, and both sides have the candidates, and both sides have the campaigns.
You're not helping with the marketing here.
Yeah,
for those of us who do congressional
still,
races.
95% of the incumbents win, and 88% of the Senate incumbents win. So the truth is, and so there is an incumbent advantage, okay? That's just a reality. And part of it is fundraising, part of it is being known. There's all sorts of reasons for it. But yes, do you make a difference all the time? I would argue most of the time you don't. But sometimes you do, and you never know what that time's going to be.
I think Bill said that, and I would agree with that. I think it matters at the margins, but the margins, it's the close races where the campaign matters, and that sort of proves, the exception proves the rule, if you will.
This is what Mark says passes for a mild dissent. You should see when he's vigorously dissenting.
We're going to take this last question.
We have a last question here, and then I have a comment.
Hi, thanks for being here. My question is about kind of the public perception of polling. And the responsibility to public discourse that polling has in some sense. Specifically, as an example, PPP, as you all know, came out with a poll comparing Congress to cockroaches and Lindsay Lohan and all sorts of stuff. Is there much of an internal dialogue amongst pollsters about whether this stuff is a sensible thing to do? I mean, of course, it just feeds into a narrative and the media thinks it's hilarious. But to what extent would you guys agree or disagree with that kind of approach to polling. Of course, it's public, but
We
still.
all read what Mark Blumenthal says about stuff like that, so we're going to let him go first.
You know, and I said campaign polling helps drive a strategy, media polling tells a story. Increasingly, and I think for PPP in particular, it is to drive hits to a website. And they've become very good at figuring out what is irresistible to my colleagues at the Huffington Post and others like it. You know, I can find frivolous questions everywhere. Do those cross the line? I don't know. I'm not sure where the line is. I don't know that. I get more troubled by questions that give people the wrong impression about something. For example, the quick hit that says, if you offer people a positive and a negative choice about a political figure, we are in a polarized age where people are going to pick the negative or the positive depending on what side they're on, no matter what the question is. So you get questions about, do you really believe the president was born in the United States or not? And I think there are, and so he's done this, other folks have done it. You end up with discussions on cable television about, oh my God, there are 30% who really believe this. That cannot be, what can these people be thinking? Well, probably they're just, a fair number of them are thinking, I don't want to say anything good about this guy because I don't like him. And when I worry more about just literally misinterpreting what public opinion is in that situation.
NBC Wall Street Journal, I'm lucky because they're a little cautious about this. We've never done a single birther question because they refused to put it in a poll because they did not want coverage generated around stuff like that. But on the other hand, here's one. These are two that have had a lot of consequence. One was, if you had a choice, what would you rather give up for the weekend, sex or your smartphone? And I lend a lot of my presentations because 15% pick their sex. They would give up sex. Now that's very funny, and people laugh.
An age skew on that.
Well, I sent it to my.
Which way?
I sent it to my 4 teenagers, and my college-age boy student wrote back, said, "I'm not one of the 15%ers, Dad." Here's another one someone thought to ask. They said, do you think the U.S. government should institute a policy that no one in America could be allowed to make more than $1 million? Like a CEO should be allowed to make $1 million. Now, see, I would have never thought to ask that because in my brain, that is so profoundly nuts. It would never occur to me to ask. And yet, 26% of Americans said, yes, the U.S. government should restrict CEO salaries to $1 million a year. Now, at the time, I was remarrying again my college sweetheart who was massively liberal. My staff was very concerned about her ideology and our happiness. And they said, this is too far. You have to call and ask her if she would say yes to this, because if she says yes, you must break the engagement. So I call her on the phone. I said, honey, I saw this question, and let me just ask you. Do you think the U.S. government should or should not, restrict CEO salary to $1 million? And there was this long pause. And I go, oh my God. Oh my God, she's wrestling with that. Oh my God, she's not screaming. Are you effing crazy? And then finally she said, no, that's too much. This is America. Government doesn't regulate income. No, that's too far to go. You don't know how close you were to having to call off the marriage, according to the public opinion strategy staff.
I was relieved to hear the end of that story. I didn't know where it was going. First of all, let me say, and Joel knows this, we've talked about this a lot. I sort of hinted at it in my initial comments. I think that polling, generally media polling in the hands of the media, is like giving a bazooka to a 6-year-old. I don't think it's handled properly, and I think it's often errant. On one day in the last campaign, one news organization reported that we were 13 points ahead, preposterous, and another news organization reported that we were 6 points down. That's a 19-point swing, but they all got reported as legitimate news, and I think the reason that news organizations do these polls, and I want to give Bill an exemption here, because the Wall Street Journal, New York, NBC poll is among the most assiduous and responsible. So, but in the main, this proliferation of public polls captures the coverage, and I'm saying this as a former political reporter, allows for lazy reporting, essentially. And I'll just share one anecdote, and then I want to sum up. When I was in the White House, I had a round table off the record with some of the senior political writers and reporters in Washington. And one of them said to me, "What are you going to do about the Recovery Act?" And I said, "What do you mean, what am I going to do about it?" And this reporter said, "Well, it's a failure." And I said, "Well, what do you mean it's a failure?" And the reporter said, "Well, only 38% of Americans approve of it." And I said, "Well, that's really not the measure by which we're going to judge the Recovery Act." The answer, you know, we're going to judge it by what the impact on the economy was. We weren't shooting for a particular poll finding with it. But this was a very thoughtful person who asked this question, and it shows you the degree to which polls have overtaken coverage. So I share Mark's sentiment. I think there has to be a lot of soul searching on this. I want to say to my young friends here that one of the thrills of being involved in politics and in the public arena is the opportunity to work with some very smart, well-motivated people. And I've worked with every single person on this stage. All of them qualify. I enjoyed every minute of working with them on various projects, and we are really, really lucky to have such a thoughtful panel here today. So I want to thank you all for sharing your thoughts with us.